Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The-Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. And today's guest is Jonathan Barnard, head of forecasting and director of global intelligence for Zenith. Jonathan, welcome to the show. It is a pleasure to virtually see you again. I know it's been a year, but I'm thinking we both look the same with the same background. So, all's good, right?
I hope so. Yes, well, it's a pleasure to talk to you again. It's always entertaining and informative. And yes, so I think much is the same, but I think a lot's changed as well. So it's good to be able to have this chat.
Oh, absolutely. And well, listen, let me just start at the beginning, because your 2022 forecast has made quite a few headlines. And quite a few. So there's a lot to go over, but let me start with some of the ones that have gotten the most attention. You've said that social media will be the fastest growing category in the next few years. And in 2022, social will be larger than television for the first time in the history of advertising. Now that's big news, big news. Can you talk about why? And I realize your figures are global, but I'm just wondering if the expansion of social is essentially happening in every country. So please tell us.
Yeah, sure. Well, to start off, I'll talk about some of the reasons why I think it's happening. First, it's because that's where a lot of consumers are spending their time. Social media started as a way of connecting people and having conversations and arranging your social life. But now it's becoming much more of an entertainment medium. So people are watching videos, they are sharing entertaining content, they're telling their friends what they should be watching. It's also becoming much more of a commerce platform. This is something that we're going to touch on a lot, I think, in our conversation, but commerce is really becoming central to a lot of media these days, and the platforms are making it more convenient to start thinking about a product, to see an ad for it, and then to be able to buy it immediately and as frictionlessly as possible. So this is making it a more direct route towards selling products, and also it has the social media has also attracted a huge new cohort of advertisers. So we're talking about small businesses, local businesses, which, if they advertised at all previously, would maybe have appeared in the local yellow pages or in directories, maybe a couple of ads at the back of the local newspaper, but not really advertised in any serious or systematic way. But the platforms have really created tools which allow these types of businesses to participate in advertising in wholly different and wholly new ways, self-serve tools that will allow them to create ads, to track the efficacy of ads, and to make sure that they continue to participate in advertising that they know boosts their top and their bottom lines. So millions of advertisers that previously either didn't take part in advertising or didn't really take part in the trackable advertising that gets picked up in our reports and those of other organizations that track this sort of advertising, they're really being picked up for the first time, and so it's really creating, it's to do with the audience. It's large, engaged, willing to buy, and it's to do with the advertisers. So it's not just the traditional advertisers, it's not just the direct-to-consumer digital brands, it's your local stores, your local specialist advertisers who want to reach hobbyists, a whole new category of advertiser.
That is really interesting, and I like the way that you put it in terms
Mm,
of the evolution of the use of social media, but also the new advertisers. What I'm wondering, see, it's very
mm,
interesting because we were thinking that direct to consumer advertisers,
mm.
such as the category has evolved, were always the new players. But now it seems that with millions of small advertisers, is that enough to show a shift in growth? Or is it possible to estimate what the percent of these new small advertisers might be? And do you think it'll keep being significant as we go on?
Yeah, I can't put any numbers on it. I wish I could, because the sort of reporting and disclosure that would be necessary just doesn't exist. But we're talking very substantial numbers here. I mean, probably well in excess of 50% of social media spend.
Oh,
Um,
that's huge.
yes,
50% of social media is from small local business. That's amazing. Wow.
yeah. These businesses, I mean, they do form a substantial proportion of GDP and account for a large amount of employment and economic activity in each country. So the fact that there were previous barriers to entry stopping them from becoming advertisers, it really sort of artificially limited their impact. So the fact that it previously wasn't economically feasible to put together a TV ad, and because it costs too much to produce, but also the wastage in showing it to too many people who'd never be interested in it. Made these types of businesses invisible as advertisers. But now that these barriers to entry have been removed, they're starting to take their rightful place on the stage of advertising as well as on the economy as a whole.
That is wonderful.
Mm.
As a supporter of small business, that's
Mm.
great, and they probably have some very interested consumers who are local
Mm.
and do want to support local. Now we just have to make sure that their creativity is up there as well.
Yes.
Which makes me think, certainly we're in such a digital world, and I believe that one of the other messages of this year's forecast is the dominance of digital media, which shouldn't come as a surprise during the behavior during the pandemic. But why don't you talk about that? Are you saying digital media will exceed 60%? Or is that right? Wow.
Yeah, that's right. So 60% of all global spend this year, having exceeded 50% just 2 years ago, I think it was. An amazing rate of growth. Now, digital obviously is a huge bucket here and refers to all sorts of different things. The reason why we talk about digital as a category is partly because of that's how it's measured, and lots of different countries have different ways of dividing up digital spending, which aren't necessarily very compatible. So if you want to talk most in the most general way about this very fast growing and significant type of advertising and talk about it globally, we do tend to talk about digital, but it includes so many different things. So obviously we've got digital display advertising, we've got paid search, we've got online video, we've got social media. There are different ways of measuring it in different countries. We used to talk a lot about online classified advertising, but which is like the digital version of old newspaper classifieds. That still exists, but it's falling quite rapidly as a share of total, simply because there are so many alternatives and so many free alternatives now that paid for online classified is starting to fall by the wayside. But yeah, there's so much of it. I think digital audio is obviously important, and podcast advertising, while not huge in scale, is certainly growing very rapidly in percentage terms. So there's a huge array of different types of advertising that comes under this
Well,
this one
what
banner.
about e-commerce? Is that separate, or is that part of digital? I mean, you said that we would
Yeah.
talk about that quite a bit.
Yeah.
So if it's not in that bucket, where does it go?
So this is something that is probably the fastest, one of the most surprising and fastest growing subcategories over the last couple of years has been what we would call retail or retailer media. So this is advertising that occurs within retailer websites or e-commerce platforms. So in the West, this is primarily Amazon. So advertising that appears on an Amazon search that may prioritize one or more brands within that search. But it's not necessarily search. It can be display advertising that pops up on a retailer's website. It could be static display, or it could be video. So it can be creating brand awareness on a website, or it can be prioritizing the order of search results. So it can be display, it can be search, but it's growing enormously quickly. We're talking about 50% year-on-year growth.
Wow. Wow. And I'm assuming Amazon has the biggest share of that, but there's got to be many others, whether it's supermarket chains who are doing it, Walmart, Asda, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Yeah. So geographically, this is very interesting. It started off in China, where e-commerce has been historically always been monetized through advertising rather than through commission, as happened in the West. So you had the platforms made their money through this form of retailer media, and Amazon started making some money through this several years ago, but it really only began to gather steam over the last 4 or 5 years, and is now growing enormously quickly. And as you say, it's led principally by Amazon outside China. But I mean, Walmart is making substantial sums on its website, and other retailers are following suit. I think, I'm not keeping track of every single retailer that launches a new platform, but a lot of them have been doing so over the last 6 months or so.
Yes, and I've noticed some, and I've seen Best Buy has done one. So you're right. Something to really keep an eye on. And I know that last year you mentioned that as growing, and it looks like it's exceeded your expectations. Speaking of growth, though, what's quite extraordinary, I think, also in your forecast is you're predicting that the global ad market will continue its recovery from the 2020 downturn. Now, you're saying perhaps 9% growth in 2022, which comes after almost 16% growth in 2021.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I've got a lot of questions. I guess number one, why aren't people happier?
Good question. Well, I think the growth is basically because of the accelerated pace of change that the economy has been forced to adopt over the pandemic, and the fact that this has been painful, going beyond the obvious reasons that people have got sick and died. It has forced consumers to very rapidly adopt to new behaviors, and all types of industries and businesses have had to scramble to respond. And a lot of this has meant new types of digital interaction. So this type of conversation that we're having right now on a video call suddenly became the mainstream form of business interaction for a large chunk of the working population. Consumers started shunning shops and buying products at home. Many consumers may never have done so before. Entertainment became home-based and digital-based. People started cooking at home and having to work out how to do so from scratch for people who'd never done so before, and so turning to video platforms to teach them how to do so. People were socializing a lot more online, and businesses had to very quickly work out how to reach consumers online, and also physically how to get products to them and services to them, to build new infrastructure that allows brands to deliver to consumers and to deal with partners, and also create, if necessary, direct-to-consumer websites that will allow consumers to find their products and order them and receive them at home. So this was a period of extreme disruption to everyone's lives, one that was largely mediated by digital media, and which required a lot of investment in digital platforms, digital infrastructure, and digital communication to allow it to happen. And that's something that drove huge growth in advertising spending, not just through existing companies, but I mean, some of the companies that we were talking about earlier, small local businesses, may never have thought of e-commerce as something they'd look at for the next 5 or 10 years, but were suddenly forced to, just to survive. I think this is something that we were discussing last year, and I think partly some of the investment that was made turned out to be more successful than businesses had initially feared, and demonstrated that maybe some of these companies should have been investing in these areas even earlier. But also, I think the necessity of continuing to invest in these areas, it became clear that it was going to remain necessary for longer than we'd hoped. So I think with the emergence of new variants of the virus, the Delta variant and the Omicron variant, of course, meaning a sudden increase in infections, we returned to some extent, probably in most countries to a lesser extent, but to some of the conditions that we saw in early to mid 2020. That meant the sort of condition that conditions persisted for longer than expected and returned more than expected, and has become a necessary and long-lasting part of doing business. It's not just an emergency measure.
No, I think you're absolutely right. That is becoming quite clear. I think that is the acceleration, how the pandemic accelerated trends that that were on the back burner for so long. I just have two quick questions. One is kind of more for the record. So have we actually exceeded the pre-COVID ad spend levels? So are we now beyond 2019? And the other question is the next obvious one: is this level of growth sustainable in the future beyond 2022?
So globally, yes, we are well above 2019 levels of spending. We ended 2021 substantially ahead. Every single region was substantially ahead. There are a few markets, if you look at some of the smaller countries, not every single one of them ended 2021 ahead of 2019, but most of them did. Can it be sustained? Well, we don't think last year's rate of growth is going to be sustained, but we do think we're going to see very high levels of growth this year, gradually tending towards more normal levels of growth over the next few years. But no, I think the sort of levels, I think there's no turning back now. The companies have invested so much in the new ways of working over the last 18 months to 2 years that the process of digital transformation, which obviously had been ongoing for many years previously, at sudden massive acceleration and will continue. I think we can expect extended levels of investment for the next year, 18 months, 2 years or so, for a fair while, and this is going to continue to stimulate rapid levels of ad spend.
Interesting. Well, that is another bit of good news there. So again, people should be happier in the industry, provided they can find people to work for them. But that's another topic which goes beyond forecasting. Just curious, you did mention, you just brought up that some countries, were maybe did not exceed levels. I'm just curious, has all of this upset the apple cart a bit in terms of growth by country or by region? Which areas of the world are now growing the fastest?
Well, I think probably the most extraordinary growth has been seen in North America and in the US, because there was barely any downturn in 2020 in terms of overall spend, and in enormous growth in 21, and we expect in 22 as well. I mean, the US, I think it's sort of, in terms of growth over this period, I think it hit the sweet spot in that there was, I think, digital transformation in the US was at a tipping point. In that it was the stage where e-commerce was becoming truly entrenched as a mainstream way of shopping, but had not yet become commonplace. So in quite a few markets in Western Europe or Asia, for example, I would say that e-commerce and digital communication had already become well entrenched and mainstream, and there was less scope for this type of accelerated transformation. Whereas in the US, obviously, it was well advanced, but not so well entrenched that there wasn't room for a huge spurt of growth in when the pandemic hit. So I would say it was open to very rapid change, and and companies had the level of capital needed to invest in this type of change due to relatively cheap money, due to venture capitalists with huge amounts of money to invest.
Well, how did China fare? Because they, of course, had some of these e-commerce systems in place before.
Yeah, so China's an interesting one as well. I mean, the economy didn't see as much of a hit because of the very early measures to contain the coronavirus. But it just has not seen quite the levels of growth that the US has. I mean, partly because China was one of the very early adopters of digital advertising, of digital business, and particularly of smartphones, of conducting transactions by smartphone, by mobile commerce, mobile entertainment, all these forms of technology. Well, a lot of them were pioneered in China. So the growth rate hasn't been so high, simply because because a lot of the innovations that were adopted elsewhere came from China.
And very, very interesting. Very interesting. Were there any surprises when you took a look at the forecasting? Were there areas, whether not only countries or regions, but were there other areas that you found intriguing, whether it was more to do with direct consumer, gaming, esports? I think I noticed something that you were saying, that the Middle East is poised for great growth. Just curious if there was something that struck you as quite interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, all of these areas really. I think gaming and esports, that's certainly something to keep close track of, because this is something that a large and growing audience of very committed people are willing to devote large amounts of time to, and yeah, it's becoming a new audience sport. And it's because of the levels of interaction that are often possible on these platforms can be much more personal than those available to watching televised sport. It can attract a very committed audience, very receptive to brand communication. So yes, that's certainly something to watch. The Middle East is an interesting one. Yes, we think there's been a lot of problems in Middle Eastern advertising in recent years, to do with the conflict and the oil price obviously is underpins much of the region's economic activity, and the recent high prices of energy and scarcity of oil in some situations has been a fillip to these markets. But we also think that the advertising markets are starting to rebuild and reach audiences that can be very interested in high-end goods, in luxury, and it will be particularly interesting to see is what happens when the Soccer World Cup takes place at the end of this year in Dubai.
Or Qatar, right? In Qatar.
You could well be right.
Yeah, FIFA. That's in November, I think. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the particularly interesting thing about this is it's taking place towards the holiday season. So normally it takes place in summer, when in the Northern Hemisphere at least, viewers are outside not paying attention to TV, particularly the young. So it's an unusual event of high viewing in summer. But this year, of course, it'll be in the lead up to Christmas and other holidays, which are obviously the key shopping season for very many markets. So it'll be combining a period of high television viewing, high demand from advertisers, and a international tournament which will be closely watched around the world, in a region which is not known for hosting these types of events. So yeah, this will be a very interesting one to watch, and potentially generate a huge amount of advertising revenue.
No, I think so. Plus, it's a quadrennial event. The Olympics kind of lost their big quadrennial ad push when they became, every other year, right, to alternate winter and summer. And I think there'll be lots of eyes on it, and I think it'll save a lot of people from those happy Christmas reruns that always seem to take place. But it's let me just it's extraordinary to me how quickly the time goes. I have two final questions for you.
Sure.
The first is, if there is one word or perhaps a phrase that you believe will characterize the coming year, what would it be?
Well, I guess my hope is that this will be a year of, I suppose you could say, consolidation. There's been so much change over and so much exploration over the last 18 months, 2 years of ways of living, of shopping, of doing business, of communicating with consumers in these vastly changed circumstances. And that has led to huge investment in all these areas, and I think some of them will prove to be very valuable in the long term. Some of them may well prove to have been valuable in this extraordinary situation, but we will be able to move past them. And I think at this point, it's not at all clear what activities, products, services are going to end up in which category. And I think this will be as the year goes on, I think this would be a process of learning what of all the new channels and activities and businesses that we've experimented with over the last period are the most valuable, are the best ways of reaching and serving consumers. What do they find of the most long-lasting use? And as we continue to expand and explore over the next few years, I think we're going to learn a lot over the next 12 months, which is going to inform what we do in the future.
Well said. Well said. That is a very interesting perspective, which leads to my last question, which is, can we finally put COVID in the rear view mirror? And maybe that's a yes, no, or maybe.
Well, I think there are lots of ways of arguing this. I think no. I think we're in it for the long haul. But yes, in that it's going to become less and less relevant to the way that we live our lives and do business. In that, what we know now, the vaccines and boosters work. They've had an extraordinary effect in protecting people over this huge surge in infections over the last few weeks. And if you look at what's happened in London and other parts of the UK, where this sort of thing is tracked quite closely, there was unprecedented levels of people testing positive over the last 6 weeks. I mean, huge growth, the likes of which we've never seen before. But the effects on hospitalizations and then people needing intensive care and then people actually dying. Hospitalizations did pick up, but there seemed that the numbers of people actually seriously affected very, very low compared to the previous levels of any previous peaks, let alone the sort of levels of infections that we were seeing. So I think once Omicron's over, barring, which is always possible, another surprise from in terms of infections and danger, I think we can start to live our lives again more normally, and the advertising business can start to, I won't say return to normal, or indeed find the new normal, because I don't think we're going to know what new normal is for a few years' time, but we can start to find our way to a post-COVID world starting now, I think.
Which speaks to your word for consolidation of so much that we've learned, tried, and maybe even at some point might discard. But well, it's always interesting. Your insights are very deep, and I never feel that we have enough time to explore them all. So maybe we should focus on some other topics and go a little bit deeper. And I do look forward to that. But thank you for at least setting up the year for us and giving us some wonderful insights, looking back and looking forward. And I know that our audience will greatly appreciate that. So thank you. The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal